Good afternoon and welcome to the first ever You On News media conference. I'm Jodie Pele and today we'll be discussing the relationship between organised crime and the media. Many people will be surprised to learn that organised crime is the biggest threat and source of physical danger to journalists. A total of 141 journalists and media workers were killed during the decade of the 2000s in attacks and reprisals blamed on criminal groups, according to the Paris-based organisation Reporters Without Borders. Organised crime is when a group of criminals form an alliance to make a vast amount of money through criminal activity and corruption, such as sexual exploitation, money laundering and drug trafficking. These criminal groups are often referred to as a gang, mafia or cartel. They liaise and conduct illegal activities in order to acquire wealth as well as gaining social status. The most prominent and profitable crime for these organised crime gangs worldwide is drug trafficking. Organised crime is not a small chore and takes a lot of preparations from the criminals who initiate it. Many of these gangs, of course, do not want to get found out, which is why, as it could jeopardise the way that they fund their lifestyle, which is why they pose such a physical threat to journalists, especially journalists who actively try to unveil the criminals' misconducts, using public interest as a legitimate reason behind their investigating of the criminal groups. Doing this kind of reporting is life-threatening and could be detrimental to a journalist. Journalists are the public's eyes and ears, and through investigative journalism, a journalist would try and get a deep insight of the organised crime, which could mean identifying members of the gang, as well as finding out what their next profit-generating scheme will be. This kind of investigation could take years. Extreme measures are taken by these gangs to ensure that they will not be revealed or caught. If the criminals do find out who is trying to investigate them and write reports on them, they will often seek to find them. This ultimately has a dramatic consequence where members of the criminal group will take it upon themselves to make sure that they are not outed. The journalist is highly likely to get kidnapped and demanded to hand over all evidence and research that they have gathered on the plotted misdemeanours. In the worst case scenario, the journalist will be murdered. Journalist Roberto Saviano has been receiving death threats for over 8 years after writing a book called Gomorrah, Italy's Other Mafia, about the Naples-based mafia, which exposed the nature of crimes by a mafia called Gomorrah conducted and the impact that these crimes had on local citizens. He also named the bosses of the mafia, something which no one had ever dared to do, out of fear for their lives and their families' safety. In an article in The Guardian Online, Roberto talks about how this book has drastically changed his life and says that for the last 8 years, he's had to travel everywhere with 7 bodyguards and 2 bulletproof cars. He talks about not being able to do simple things, such as going for a stroll or even going for a beer, just because his name is associated with terms such as death and murder. Our first speaker today is James McAndrew, who will talk about the threat to journalists from organised crime.
Thanks, Jodie. Organised crime is continuing to pose one of the greatest threats on global journalistic freedom, which has previously gone unnoticed. As consumers of media, we are often overexposed to the continual coverage of international wars and breaking stories that the threats posed to international press freedom and to journalists as individuals often go unreported. Of course, organised crime has evolved greatly from the well-renowned mafia format and now exists in many other forms, from militia groups in Iraq and Syria to government-led killings in Russia. This year's attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris is a prime example of organised crime's threats on journalists, proving that you don't need to be in a war zone to be at risk. Although we may not associate ISIS with organised crime, the terrorist group making a considerable amount of money selling oil and weapons across the Middle East. The cell associated with ISIS who carried out the Charlie Hebdo attacks acted alone as a terrorist cell, but through the support of ISIS and organised crime. Using the data and research provided by the Committee to Protect Journalists, the South East Europe Media Organisation and Reporters Without Borders report into organised crime on the media provided sufficient data to base the following discussion in this report. Often, it is not who is being reported about, but the very subject itself. In a study conducted by the Committee to Protect Journalists, the results concluded that 35% of reporters killed between 1992 and 2015 were reporting on information related to crime and corruption. In many countries, crime and politics often exist side by side, which leads to a breakdown in freedom of a nation's press and the safety of journalists. This is an ongoing battle between the freedom of the press, politics and crime, and a war that journalists are now suffering in. The pressure and threats that journalists now face from organised crime bodies has no doubt impacted on the credibility of their work. The lack of contact within the crime organisations and the threats these pose to the journalists decreases the amount of contacts and sources that were once the beacons of crime reporting. Problems are now arising as organised crime groups are taking control of local press outlets, which grants them control of press freedom. In the UK since 1992, only one journalist has been killed whilst working and representing a media organisation. Martin O'Hagan, a journalist in Northern Ireland for the paper Sunday World, was shot outside of his home in Lurgan in September 2001. O'Hagan was an investigative journalist that spent years exposing the secrets of the IRA and was kidnapped by the group in the 1990s. He was killed as a result of the information that he had reported about the group, who were funded by organised crime. In the UK, journalists have an immense level of protection as an individual and in the freedom of their work in comparison to the rest of the world. Through law in the UK and the Human Rights Act Article 10, which includes the freedom of expression, acts as a shield to all journalists working in the country. Journalists are now seeking protection from national and international bodies to put an end to the threat to the industry and to free speech. In 2010, the Mexican government passed a convention to increase the protection of journalists, including passing a legislation that sees threats and murders of journalists a federal crime. Legislation is a tool for journalists working on a local and national scale to enhance the protection on their lives. Arguably, the prominence of organised crime increases in countries that are controlled by radical governments, or in locations that are geographically challenging to police and maintain, such as the Amazon rainforest. Reporters Without Borders is the primary body and network aiding the work of journalists and independent news organisations that are operating in sensitive and unstable environments. The UN has praised the organisation for their work in the protection of journalists. They can offer financial aid for journalists in extreme circumstances and even fund their families. Reporters Without Borders have also set up an emergency international 24/7 SOS helpline for journalists who are in danger. This site is the leader in support networks for journalists operating in difficult situations, but more needs to be done to ensure the legal protection for free speech across the globe. There are several areas that could enhance the protection for journalists working closely to organised crime and corruption, and social media could be a journalist's biggest tool in doing so. By following trending topics surrounding breaking news, it's become increasingly more straightforward for eyewitnesses and sources to be accessed from the safety of your own home. Journalists are using social media as a support network to stay in touch with colleagues, families and friends. It is also crucial to provide the latest in breaking news from their locations. This is a key technology that could potentially save the lives of journalists working worldwide. Despite the issues in the verification process, social media networks should be utilised to capitalise on the growing strengths of citizen-based journalism, although journalists can use social media as a support network with other journalists. Placing Reporters Without Borders aside, there are a few international networks and bodies backed by international organisations and governments that assist the work of journalists. In many countries, journalists today must now value their lives as the costs of free speech and protection cannot be guaranteed from organised crime, as taking a step back from the front line may be the primary way in improving safety within the media. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Denise Anderson, our next speaker, will talk about organised crime in the UK, in particular reference to fraud.
Thank you, JD. Millions of people fall victims to different types of scams every year. The most common type in the UK is fraud. It isn't always easy for fraud to be detected, and for this reason, fraud is a crime that many criminals tend to get away with. An example where fraudulent behaviour has been alleged was with a British man named Navanda Desai, who has been accused of causing the May 2010 Wall Street market to crash. Navanda is charged with using computer programs to create fake trades on market links to Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He is believed to have made £27 million. He has been held significantly responsible for his actions and charged with 1 count of wire fraud, 10 counts of commodities fraud, 10 counts of commodities manipulation, and 1 count of spoofing, which is a practice of bidding or offering with intent to cancel the bid offer before execution. Organised crime is an international crime that affects many individuals around the world. It is essentially defined as groups who work together on a continuous basis to engage in criminal activities. These criminal activities are performed by various forms of organised crime groups. The biggest crime groups in the world originate from Japan, Russia, Italy, and Mexico. Organised crime is similar to legal businesses in some ways, as they are both in business to make profits. However, the people involved with organised crime are prepared to trade in illegal commodities and use violence in order to achieve their aims. Many people in the UK find themselves either affected by or involved in organised crime, and for this reason there are a number of safety precautions that assist individuals who find themselves in unresolvable situations. When looking at organised crime in the UK, it is big business organisations that play a big role. Many organisations within the UK work together to fight fraud and bring fraudsters to justice. The British Banking Association, also known as the BBA, is a leading association within the UK's banking and finance services sectors. This association in particular speaks for 233 banking members from 60 different countries. It deals with banking issues internationally as well as issues within the UK. Another similar UK-based organisation that assists people with organised crime is the CIFAS, which is also known as the UK's Fraud Prevention Service. This organisation in particular is the world's first not-for-profit fraud data sharing scheme. This means that this organisation does not earn profits from its owners. Instead, all the money made goes toward achieving the company's aims. Following specification by the Home Office, which comes under the Serious Crime Act 2007, public authorities are now able to join the CIFAS. They are also able to share information in order to help the organisation prevent fraud. The company has 270 members across various fields such as banking, finance, mail orders, insurance, and saving and investments. These organisations stand as an example of a few that comes together to provide a helpline for those involved or affected by fraudulent activities. They work as a solution to their problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Our next speaker, Callum Malone, talks about organised crime internationally, looking at Mexico and Nigeria as two separate case studies. We also have an exclusive interview from Nigeria with crime reporter Joseph Ishu.
Thanks, Jodie. The Mexican drug cartels are infamous around the world for their violent nature and the sheer size of their criminal enterprises that they run. There are varying statistics which demonstrate the incredible number of journalists who have been killed over the past few years, with the Mexico Human Rights Commission putting the number at 81 since the year 2000. Of this 81, 69 are believed to have been killed by the cartel, and in addition, 11 more have disappeared since 2003. For journalists working in the country, there are countless dangers, including threats from both sides of the law, corrupt officials, threat of kidnapping, and of course, as mentioned earlier, murder. Over the last 8 years, around 100,000 people have been killed and another 22,000 are missing as a consequence of the drug wars. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, between 1992 and 2015, the motive for the killings of 32 journalists was as a direct result of publishing their work. 81% of these journalists covered crimes in some form. Another frightening statistic is that of the 32 confirmed murders, 90% of them went without any form of justice or charge. Often, as was the case with two journalists, Jose Antonio Garcia Pac and Mauricio Estrada Zamora, who disappeared in 2006 and 2008 respectively, the Mexican legal system can tie up cases for so long the victim's family never see any kind of justice. These cases were passed from department to department and eventually abandoned. The rise of the Mexican drug cartels began in the 1980s, and slowly more and more cartels emerged, each controlling a different territory in the country. At this moment, according to Reporters Without Borders, the most powerful cartels in Mexico are the La Familia Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Los Zetas Cartel, and the Pacific Cartel. The Mexican government does at last seem to be trying to combat the problem, A large-scale offensive against the cartels, which began in December 2006 and which is still ongoing, involves more than 50,000 Mexican troops. In 2010, Mexico's federal government signed a new convention on the protection of journalists to make any aggression towards them a federal crime. However, the country's former federal attorney, General Samuel Gonzalez, has said without any structural reform of the relevant agencies, there's a danger that this will just increase the likelihood of cases getting bogged down in bureaucracy. Distinguishing feature of Latin America's cartels is the way they operate as competitors of the state, sometimes directly confronting authorities, while all the time cultivating contacts within the state's apparatus. The majority of newspapers in the country are very careful when it comes to reporting on the activities of the cartels, even when these criminal groups are responsible for the deaths of fellow journalists. In January 2010, when journalist Martinez Ochoa was murdered, of the 17 papers in the region where he worked, only one covered the story. The rest did not mention it at all. Under threat and with limited resources, the media often end up restricting themselves to just quoting official sources, the Reporters Without Borders believes. The problems faced by journalists in Mexico are only made worse by the apparent collusion of the organised crime syndicates and the government. The report's findings are unfortunately damning for the authorities, both local and federal. The passivity or negligence of the excessive number of entities dedicated to defending press freedom in all branches of the government and the tendency to cancel out each other are not the only reasons why the Mexican media's ordeal continues. According to a Reporters Without Borders report, the authorities are also accomplices, if not responsible, for serious human rights violations, including journalists being killed. In 2014, 2 out of the 3 journalists who were killed in Mexico were investigating links between the government and the cartel. Many mainstream media outlets in Mexico do seem to be controlled by either the government or the cartels. For this reason, many journalists who want to expose corruption and crime have begun using the internet and social media to do so. One such social media journalist was Dr. Maria del Rosier Fuentes Rubio, a reporter who covered crime in Mexico. She helped run a citizen news website which had amassed a large online following with over 500,000 Facebook likes and more than 100,000 Twitter followers. Although she wrote under a false name, members of the cartel were able to find out her true identity, and she was subsequently kidnapped and brutally killed. Furthermore, her killers used her social media account to announce her death and post pictures of her dead body. They also sent out a warning to other journalists. Shut down your account, do not risk your family's lives as I have done. I ask for your forgiveness. Now for a look at Nigeria, whose media faces different problems to those of their Mexican counterparts. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, is listed by the FBI as one of the countries evolving the new trend of organised crime across the world. Very many Nigerians are known to be involved in drugs and human trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, and document forgery. The rapid growth of organised crime in Nigeria has been greatly attributed to the already existing high level of corruption, massive poverty, infrastructural decay, religious fundamentalism, unpatriotic political leadership, and illiteracy. A report by Strategy Page, a leading resource on armed forces officers worldwide, has named Nigeria the centre for organised criminal activities in Africa as a result of its corruption rate, which aids the survival of criminal enterprises. Reporting crime in Nigeria with a focus on organised crime is often dangerous beat for journalists. Due to the risks involved, many journalists shy away from this field as their lives continue to be under threat by organised crime practitioners who have great influence in the police, judiciary, military and high political hierarchy. A classical case of the murder of one of Nigeria's finest and most courageous editors, Dele Giwa, occurred in Lagos in 1986. It was linked to the investigation of a drug cartel with very powerful political connections. Mr. Giwa was the editor and founder of one of Nigeria's most influential and authoritative news magazines, Newswatch. Our correspondent, Philomena Okulu, interviewed prominent crime journalist Joseph Ishu from Pilot newspaper about the problems the Nigerian media face when reporting organised crime in the country.
In countries such as Mexico, Colombia, and Nigeria, organized crime practitioners are known to be very powerful and have infiltrated the political, economic, and social system of these nations to cover up their illegal and murderous activities. In the media, the threat to the safety of journalists by these gangs has forced many media organizations and journalists to abandon the investigation and reporting of criminal activities. To speak to us on this trend, we have Joseph Ishu, Senior Crime and Defense Correspondent with the Nigerian Pilot newspaper. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Do you feel enough is being done in the coverage of organized crime in Nigeria?
I don't think so, because I've covered crime and I've done investigative journalism for over a decade now. The trend is very stressful because it requires a lot of resources and adequate protection of a journalist who has embarked on such venture. So, but because like in the private practice, that is private media organizations, the publisher or the management may not be willing to dish out money for one to go on.
Joseph Ishu in the interview addressed fundamental issues affecting the coverage of organised crime by journalists in Nigeria. He explained that there was no legislation protecting journalists from the hazards of reporting crime in the country. He further noted that the level of corruption in internal security networks, especially the police and the judiciary, had made the journalists more vulnerable to hazards. He advised that journalists covering organised crime must take steps to ensure their personal safety in the course of their assignments or after. Back to you, Jodie.
Thank you, Callum. As all of our speakers has emphasised, organised crime is an incredibly hard field for journalists to report on, especially in Nigeria and Mexico, due to the substantial risk of danger that comes with it. However, saying that, crimes committed by gangs has had a lot more coverage over the recent years. As Joseph Ishu said, a journalist will need adequate protection when covering a major corruption or a major crime story which involves a gang or a mafia. It is evident that organised crime and the reporting of it is overlooked, and in Nigeria this is partially due to the publisher or organisation not being willing to invest money into the protection of the journalist or fund them for travels to other places to investigate a story. Investigative journalism is a risky aspect of journalism. Journalists need to make sure that they are well equipped and specially trained about how to report on crime. Not having sufficient knowledge on the matter and how to pursue investigative journalism could result in devastating consequences, such as murder, which is on the increase with journalists who report crime. The coverage of organised crime is still a major issue worldwide, and there are practices that need to be implemented to protect journalists. It is in the public interest to be informed of crimes that affect them and the society that they live in, and it's the journalist's duty to be able to provide such things without fear of their lives. So James, how is social media making it a bit easier and safer for journalists to report on organised crime?
Well, I think that social media is definitely the landmark platform that improves safety for journalists, as it allows them to sort of not only work from at home and in the office without even going out and putting themselves at risk, but it allows them to sort of communicate with their audience as well and really improve engagement. But obviously that means that journalists aren't being sent to dangerous locations anymore as fear of their safety, which is a good and bad thing. But it obviously means now that they have to utilise citizen journalism footage, which is difficult to verify in order to have their work. But journalists can of course now track, trace and investigate organised crime through social media, as illegal trades now take place online. But this is obviously just a safer way for journalists to work now using social media.
Thank you, James. Denise, earlier Callum talked about organised crime in Nigeria and Mexico. Do you think it's a big issue in the UK?
I think it's a huge issue in the UK, but however it's downplayed. I think the UK should be taking it seriously, as criminals within the UK are incredibly sly and smart with their actions, and they're not usually charged with their criminal actions. So I think it's a very big issue.
Thank you. And Callum, is there any sign of the situation in Mexico improving? What difference would the legislation of drugs make?
Well, unfortunately there isn't any signs that it is improving. Actually, it could be getting worse. Only in February this year, a journalist was killed by a police officer who admitted the killing had been organised by the mayor of the town. And also, according to Article 19, a human rights group in London, the average number of aggressions towards journalists each year has increased to 328. This is up from 182 in 2012. In terms of legalising drugs, as many states in the US seem to be doing so, many do believe that this is driving down the price of marijuana per kilo, and it's actually fallen 50% over the past year. And there is hope that if it falls any further, it will just cut off the cartel's money supply completely, as it won't be viable business anymore.
Thank you, Callum. So as you can see, organised crime is still a major issue worldwide. However, the more that it's publicised, the less likely that journalists will face the danger that they currently do. Until this happens though, and while journalists are still shying away from reporting crime, it will still be an issue. Thank you for watching.